Good afternoon. My name is Nickel McDonough. I'm going to be speaking to you today about one of the dominant vocal styles of the medieval and Renaissance period, the castrati, and how they came to dominate Renaissance opera in the 17th century. I am the Arts and Sciences Minister for the province of Malagentia and also currently their Bardic Champion, member of the Order of the Silver Tiger, member of the Order Silver Brooch. I'm so happy to go ahead and talk to you today. Any of you that don't know me, I also studied music in my mundane life. I have my bachelor's and my master's in musicology, and this is the kind of thing that I just love geeking out over. So I hope you enjoy. Let's start first with who and what the castrati were. As the name suggests, the castrati were male singers who were castrated before puberty in order to maintain the vocal quality of a talented boy soprano. Castration before puberty, or in its very early stages, prevents the larynx from being transformed by normal physiological events. While high male ranges, tenors and countertenors, certainly existed and were used throughout the medieval and Renaissance, the castrati were considered a distinct vocal type altogether. You could even say it was a eunuch vocal range. But the jokes aren't going to get any better. So their vocal ranges were considered super high tenor, above what we would consider a countertenor today, with an extensive falsetto range above that, and a solid tenor range chest voice. The presence of castrati singers in the Western classical music tradition is known throughout the courts of Europe and documented from the 12th century until the Papal States outlawed the practice in 1870. They were the last of the European nation-states to ban the practice. However, the origins of the practice date back to the early Byzantines. In a book analyzing the paintings of the Byzantine Empire, Neil K. Moran wrote, "While we cannot be certain that treble voices sang in the 15th century in Hagia Sophia, there is abundant evidence that treble voices, whether those of females, children, or eunuchs, sounded in the great urban basilicas of Constantinople and Thessaloniki throughout the Byzantine period. Illuminated manuscripts and musical sources testify to the presence of eunuchs in the choirs of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople." Eunuch singers were well known throughout the liturgical choirs of the empire from at least the 9th century, and many singers were brought to Western Europe after the Fourth Crusade in the early 13th century. The conceit behind the desire for eunuch singers was born from the desire to keep particular singers in the employ of the church when their voices were considered exemplary. As Francis Rogers wrote in an article about the male soprano in 1919, a boy had scarcely attained efficiency as a church singer when the process of mutation robbed him of his peculiar vocal fitness and transformed his voice into quite another organ, an octave lower in pitch and altogether masculine. Spain in particular tried to remedy this issue by developing a training regimen specifically geared towards development of the falsetto voice. Known as contraltini, these singers had the vocal range desired, but lacked the strength that other vocal ranges had. Generally, you would need 2 contraltini for each other singer in your choir, and given the training needed and the expense needed to hire them, it just wasn't feasible for most churches on an ongoing basis. Normally, the practice of castration of boy singers is viewed as a way to preserve a talented boy singer's vocal range. However, there were other physiological effects that were desirable. The lack of testosterone also affected the joints and the limbs. Castrati were known for their elongated and thin arms and legs. As well, because the joints along the sternum and the spine were more malleable, the extensive training that they would go through provided them unrivaled breath capacity and vocal strength. Their voices also stayed extraordinarily flexible, and had a sharply different timbre than a developed female voice. While the castration of male singers is a well-documented practice, it's important to note that throughout much of the medieval and Renaissance, castrati were extremely rare. Partly, this is because of the extensive training that their voices required to be effective. There are reports throughout the 1560s, 70s, and 80s of the royal courts of Europe seeking castrati and having difficulty locating them to hire. The estates of the Italian peninsula were very fond of them, and were largely considered the origin of Europe's castrati. In contrast, the French generally considered castrati to be distasteful. As we start to look later in time, into the 18th century and beyond, up to 4,000 boys were castrated and sent to be trained as singers a year. The escalation in the practice is only one of the myriad reasons why they were eventually banned. The process of creating a castrato singer was not without inherent danger. As you can imagine, a sensitive operation like this in Renaissance Europe exposed males to tremendous risk of infection. But beyond that, and if you'll forgive me a little bit of understatement, medical castration is extremely painful. Boys had to be old enough to have developed a singing voice that could be considered trainable, but not quite have reached puberty. They were generally between the age of 10 and 12 years old. To help them endure the procedure and prevent the type of physical reaction to the surgery that could lead to its failure or the patient's death on the table, they were often given a nearly lethal dose of opium. In cases where the narcotic was not available, surgeons would attempt to immobilize the patient by compressing the carotid artery. If the patients emerged from the surgery at all, they often did so with a crippling reliance on opium. Even with that considered, the practice was not viewed as particularly severe by the public. After all, it only required about 2 weeks of recovery. The risks to the newly castrated singer did not end there, however. Despite the fervor with which they were sought out, making a career was extremely difficult. Very few achieved any level of fame whatsoever, and only about 10% were even able to make a living. Even as the appetite for operatic castrati picked up in the 17th century, only about 1% would ever see the stage. The vast majority would make up church choirs, living both impoverished and sterile lives. Still, throughout Europe, they were very popular. Until the turn of the 17th century, they were largely considered church singers. This was in no small part because of the Catholic Church doctrine throughout the Renaissance that directed women to be silent during Mass. At this time in musical history, we are at the height of the era of the motet, which included virtually any number of voices. During this time period, sacred music is known for its extensive ornamentation and its thick polyphony. From a practical point of view, this requires a wide range of available voices. The castrati filled the gap in that vocal range that women weren't allowed to fill. Even after the ban on women singing was lifted, castrati remained popular in interior voices, your alto and your contralto, because of the strength of their singing. With the advent of opera in Italy at the beginning of the 17th century, castrati singers made the transition from sacred to secular performance. While they began as replacements for female singers, by the end of the 17th century, virtually every opera called for a castrati singer explicitly. These singers became the rock stars of their time because their high, strong voices were viewed as symbols of heroic virtue. The most famed castrati operatists are names we still know today. Artists like Farinelli, Senesino, and Pacchiarotti were superstars throughout the continent and could command huge sums of money. They lived lavishly and inspired hysterical reactions from audiences. As the story goes, in the early 18th century, it was the recasting of a castrato singer that saved the career of George Friedrich Handel, considered now one of the titans of the Baroque era. Simultaneously and contrastingly, castrati were mocked for their strange appearance and poor acting at the advent of the Age of Opera. Those outside of the art-loving elite first mocked them for filling feminine heroic roles which they had no business singing, and then considered it further absurd that they would be cast as roles such as Alexander the Great and the famed knight Roland. Characters from history known for their virility, among other things. But, once again, the misogyny of the Papal States paved the way for the castrati to be successful by instituting a ban on women performing on stage. Eventually, these absurdities were overlooked as just part of the spectacle of opera and its inherent suspension of disbelief, and they remained the preeminent male singers for over a century. It was Giacomo Rossini, the famed opera composer in the 1800s, that first began openly condemning their performances and all but drove them from the stage. So who were some of these famed castrati from 17th century opera? The first male soprano of whom we have any detailed knowledge was Loreto Vittori, born 1588 and died in 1670. At an early age, he entered the service of Cosimo del Medici and was showcased throughout the opera stages in Florence. In 1622, he became a member of the papal choir, but continued his operatic appearances. He was a composer and a poet, as well as a singer, and his contemporaries set no bounds to the expression of their admiration and showered him with gifts every time he came to town. Another famous male soprano of the 17th century was Baldassare Ferri from Perugia, Italy, born 1610 and died in 1680. His professional career was one long succession of artistic triumphs. Unlike most other castrati, he was castrated at a young age because of a serious accident endured as a child. He was held in high esteem not only in Italy, but also in Poland, Germany, and Sweden, where royalty showered him with wealth and honors, and the public fawned on him enthusiastically. All contemporary comments agree in the perfection of his person, his voice, and his art. Ferri provides a good example of the wealth that castrati singers were able to command during their lifetimes. When he died in 1680, he left about 600,000 Italian scudi to charity. At that point in time, a single scudi would have been worth about 1 month of lodging and provisions in London, or enough to pay for an entire season's crop of wheat from a local farmer. It's nearly impossible to put in terms of modern wealth, but we can try just by looking at the raw metal makeup of the coins. Scudi was a gold coin that came in weighing at about 3.5 grams, and given today's rate of exchange, that fortune would be worth about $38 million. Finally, there was Giovanni Francesco Grossi, born 1653 and died in 1697, murdered on a road for having an affair with the Countess Elena Forni. He was known as Si Face from one of his most successful roles, and his name is closely associated with some of the earlier works of the composer Alessandro Scarlatti. He, too, was famous for the beauty of his voice and the noble expressiveness of his style. He came to England for a time and was a member of the choir of James II and sang in the salon of Samuel Pepys in February of 1668. Now, Pepys was famously lukewarm about castrati singers, having experienced many of them. And yet he wrote in October of 1668, having attended the same opera and seeing the same castrato singer 3 times in quick succession. There we did hear the eunuch who it seems is a Frenchman but long bred in Italy, sing, which I seemed to take anew to me. Such action and singing I could never have imagined to have heard, and do make good whatever I had heard about them previous. Many presume that the Frenchman was actually the Italian Baldassare Ferre. Now, I'm not going to get into Farinelli of Andria, who is undoubtedly the most famous castrato of all time, because he's firmly beyond the scope of the Renaissance, having been born in 1705. However, his story is fascinating, and if you want to see an expression of the type of wealth and lifestyle these performers enjoyed, the movie Il Castrato is about him, and it's definitely worth watching. There's also quite a bit written about how castrati in general were treated throughout the Renaissance and early 18th century, including lots about the politics of whether they should be allowed to get married or own property. In general, the mistreatment was applied to eunuchs as a whole, and castrati became more of an exception as individuals accumulated wealth and fame. But it's important to note that their lives were not always splendid. As Tucker Lieberman wrote in his critique of a text talking about the politics of eunuchs from 1707, castrati are only conditionally loved, since nothing in Italy is so contemptible as a eunuch that can't sing. All that to say that during the 17th and 18th centuries, the castrati enjoyed tremendous success throughout Europe. It was Valeria Finucci that called the castrato the single best-known Italian export on the continent. It's hard to underscore just how prevalent castrati singers were throughout early opera. Angus Herriot, in his famous book The Castrati in Opera from 1956, estimated that 70% of all the male singers in opera were castrati during the 18th century. And they were wildly popular. They would be showered with gifts when they sang in a particular city or opera house. Women wore medallions with their portraits around their necks, arms, and sewn into their shoes. They were viewed as creatures that were superhuman, simultaneously man, woman, and child, in a nod to the Holy Trinity. Their singing was considered divine, and they were as if they were the vessel through which the voice of God could travel. Thank you all for tuning in and watching. If you'll excuse a little bit of modernism, I'm going to leave you here with the only recording of a castrato known to exist. He's one of the last castrato surviving. His name was Alessandro Moneschi, and the recording was made in the early 20th century. And I can tell you, as a trained singer, and one that had a particularly high singing voice before I got old, I can tell you that his vocal quality is absolutely remarkable and worth listening to for how different it sounds from anything else that you'll hear today. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm going to leave links below to how you can go ahead and contact me if there are any questions or if you'd like to continue the conversation. Thank you very much. And thank you to the East Kingdom College of Performers for putting on the Schola this weekend. It's greatly appreciated.